Coming up on today's show, you never know what our celebrity historian will have up his sleeve. Rafi Andonian joining us right after this short break. Well, George Washington became the father of the country during the Christmas season with the defining moment of the American Revolution. What would it be like to spend Christmas with George Washington? Rafi Andonian joining us to give us his thoughts on what he thinks his Christmas would have looked like. Good morning. Welcome back.
Good morning. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas.
Yes, I love it. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. And tell me, how did George Washington spend Christmas?
Well, that White Christmas song really applies here because in Christmas 1776, it's snowing, there's freezing rain, and George Washington and his soldiers, remember, he's not president in 1776, he's a general leading soldiers in the American Revolution shortly after the Declaration of Independence. On Christmas Day, they're trying to cross the river, the famous painting of the crossing of the Delaware River. And part of the reason that's such a famous moment is because it would have been a really crazy thing to do in all that winter mix. There's freezing rain in their face. Two of the three envoys that are going across the river don't make it across, but George Washington and some of his men finally make it across the river hours too late. And because it's Christmas, because of the weather situation, they end up surprising the British and get a surprise victory that turns the fortunes of the American Revolution at that point in time. It looked pretty bad for the Americans at that point. But in that surprise attack, that turns the fortunes for a string of victories afterwards, which is why Christmas Day 1776 is so important in the history of the American country and, of course, George Washington himself. Now, it doesn't end there. A year later, the following winter, and for winter quarters at the famous Valley Forge, well, right around Christmas time, George Washington joined his men in winter quarters. It was a particularly harsh winter that they had to endure and quarter up. And he wanted to say, as he said, to share in the hardship and partake in every inconvenience. This is what George Washington was really good at, was showing that he was with his men, the morale to hold it together in the darkest moments. And here he had done it a second time. And the third and final part I point to during the American Revolution is when the revolution is finally won in 1783. The Americans have gained their independence and George Washington goes back to Congress. Remember, he's not president yet. He's going to be president years later. He's just a general, he's a commander-in-chief of the forces. He goes to Congress and just 2 days before Christmas resigns his commission because he wanted to make sure that in a republic, he gave back the power voluntarily to the civilian authority that had given him the military command and retires into private citizen life. Of course, he didn't know then that he'd later become the first president under the new Constitution to come. But that is why Christmas is so important in the history of this country and for the father of our country.
Oh my gosh, wow. Tell me a little bit about the traditions and celebrations in the time of George Washington.
All right, so you might think that George Washington, man, this guy over Christmas is experiencing hardship after hardship. It was a rough life. In fact, even when he was a kid, at Christmas Eve, their house burned down and he had to spend it in a spare kitchen. It was crazy. But let's say after the revolution, everything's all fine and dandy. You go over to George Washington's home. You're going to get a dish like what I have over here. This is known as Yorkshire Christmas pie. It is like a chicken pot pie, but it is like a chicken pot pie, but it has in it chicken, turkey, and bacon. So it's really loaded. Let me show you how you would do this. And you can find a recipe for this at mountvernon.org, which is, of course, his home, straight from the source. Or you can actually make it at home. Or you can also go to noshingswithnicole.com, who does a lot of cultural and historical recipes, and she has a step-by-step detail that you can make this at home. George Washington's own recipe of this English dish. Now, you cut a hole into this, like I just did here. You bring in the gravy, and look how we're going to pour it in so it seeps into the dish. Okay, you pour that gravy in there, and you see how it soaks in. And now we're going to cut a slice. And now with this, what I want you to remember with this is that this is part of the partying that Virginians did in the colonial and revolutionary period, because the Virginians are trying to copy the English. The English celebrated the 12 days of Christmas, and in the 12 days of Christmas, they would do things like drinking, feasting, masquerade balls, gambling. It was really wild. And so these Virginians trying to copy the English are trying to, they're not going to be quite as extreme as the English, but they're going to be doing quite a bit of feasting. Now let's see how I cut this slice over here. And when they do that feasting, they're going to have 20 to 40 courses. So this is just one dish out of 20 to 40, but a centerpiece dish for sure. And let's take a good look at that slice over there. Take a look at those layers in there. You can see on this side also. So you can see in there the fillings, the chicken, the turkey, the bacon. It's really cool. And so this dish you can make at home. If you want to take a few hours to bring George Washington in your home, you go to either noshingswithnicole.com or you go to mountvernon.org, and you will find that recipe so you can make it at home. Now, it wasn't always crazy parties for the colonials. If you're in Virginia, you're going to have that kind of partying. But if you're in New England, that's not exactly what happened. So different regions did different things. In New England, you have the Puritans. They wanted to purify the Church of England or the English church from what they saw all this revelry and excess, you know, like all those masquerades and gambling and partying. They were like, that's too much, man. That's crazy. So they did the opposite. For them, it was like another workday. For example, in Plymouth, the Pilgrims that we all think of for Thanksgiving, well, they didn't really like Christmas, all right? What they did, for example, is one guy started celebrating Christmas, and they detained him so that he can become better informed, as they put. Massachusetts, a neighboring colony, what they did is they had a fine if you were celebrating Christmas because they saw all that excess as a dishonor to God. So think about this. Massachusetts, Virginia, both colonies, both English colonies, but they have very different reactions because the Virginians are trying to kind of copy the English, whereas the Puritans are saying, that's not for us. That's too Catholic. That's too pagan. We don't want to do that stuff. That's too excessive. So we had different takes on Christmas celebrations back then. But for me, look, if I'm not hanging out in a white Christmas, not the kind of white Christmas you want, over Christmas of 1776 with George Washington, I want to be hanging out with George Washington down in Virginia after all that stuff is over, rather than with the Puritans. They're a little bit too stiff for me, so I can have fun eating a bunch of food and drinking as well.
Okay, that is perfect. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Yeah.
I definitely learned a few tricks and tips. Obviously, that food looks delicious. Thank you so much for joining us. Like always, it's a pleasure.
Of course. Thank you. Remember, connect with the daddy of our country through food, just like you connect with your grandparents when you try to eat their food and you think the kind of, these family recipes that you have in that make you reconnect with family members of the past. Maybe some of them have passed away. This is a way to reconnect with the ancestry of our country.
I love it. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure, Rafi.